we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
The Indochina War's negotiations were ultimately failures as lasting compromises. The causes of this failure boil down to ideological nationalism, unending desires for victory, and keeping peace brief. These major roadblocks made it difficult to prevent the nearly 2 decades of war in Indochina. France's determination to hold on to Indochina is what sparked the Indochina Wars. France started having a presence in Indochina in 1615 through Catholic missions. These missions gave the French an excuse to keep soldiers inside of Indochina, which led to eventual conflicts in 1858. These conflicts were on and off until 1885, when all of Vietnam fell to France. Soon after, Cambodia and Laos also fell. France remained mostly in control, besides small uprisings, until 1941, when Indochina was being occupied by France and Imperial Japan at the same time. In 1945, the Japanese forced a coup against the French colonial government. Imperial Japan also fell this year. This left local groups to take power in their respective countries, but France quickly occupied Cambodia and Laos and seized Vietnam on March 8, 1949. After fighting the revolutionary group Viet Minh. Of course, the fighting never stopped. The United States soon swooped in to assist the French to put down the rebellious forces, likely because these forces had underlying communist motives. Despite U.S. aid, a large stronghold fell to the Viet Minh in 1954, and the remaining French forces surrendered. This defeat sparked an international eagerness for peace in the war-torn region. The Geneva Agreement was in the works. The Geneva Agreement of 1954 included Cambodia and Laos, now independent communist-backed North Vietnam, and Western-backed South Vietnam, the US, the UK, the USSR, France, and China. This agreement was destined to fail from the start. As Asian politics expert Professor Joel Johnson puts it, France was desperate to reassert its claims to at least part of Southeast Asia, but it no longer had the power to make that a reality. At the same time, Communist China and Soviet Russia were both on the rise, seeking extension of their influence in Southeast Asia. Along with this, the Geneva Agreement does not necessarily create an environment for lasting peace. While there are mentions of reunification throughout the document, such as pending the general elections which will bring about the unification of Vietnam, it isn't enforced. The main point of the document is generally to cease hostilities and make numerous commissions to supervise. There is one striking blow to the agreement besides the vagueness of reunification ideas. Chapter 6, Article 28, responsibility for the execution of the agreement on the cessation of hostilities shall rest with the parties. This left open the opportunity for North Vietnam to invade South Vietnam. Undeterred by these immediate flaws, the agreement was signed on July 21, 1954, ending the First Indochina War. Due to new national aspirations, the Emperor of South Vietnam, Bao Dai, abdicated to make room for his own prime minister, Ngo Dinh Diem, to become president. North Vietnam stayed under the control of the Communists in Ho Chi Minh and was aligned with the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong was a South Vietnamese organization that worked to institute communism in the South, which led to insurgencies that were supported by the North. During all of this, Laos and Cambodia remained comparatively neutral, both staying monarchies after the agreement. This began the Second Indochina War, or as it is better known, the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is the longest war America has ever been a combatant in, making it devastating to all countries involved. Since France was no longer aiding the effort, victory was much harder to achieve for the U.S. Even Cambodia and Laos continued to be kept heavily involved in the war, despite their self-declared neutrality, with over 2.7 million tons of bombs being dropped on Cambodia alone. Because of these factors, peace was attempted. However, there were many issues. Firstly, before Nixon was elected president, there is evidence he disturbed peace talks as to not let the incumbent Democrat, President Lyndon B. Johnson, win peace. In uncovered notes from Nixon's secretary on a phone conversation, there are some sketchy phrases such as, "keep Anna Chennault, a diplomat working on South Vietnam," and "any other way to monkey wrench it, anything Richard Nixon can do." Secondly, it is likely that nothing ever clicked because the North Vietnamese had wanted victory and to establish communism in the South, with this stance being hard to shift. The South and the U.S. simply wanted aggression to stop. Thus, there was a distinct lack of progress until the Paris Peace Accords of 1973. The Paris Peace Accords eerily resemble the Geneva Agreement, often citing the exact document for parts of its own text. This is likely one of the reasons it failed. Even though the Accords mention words like reconciliation and concord, and directly reference a vote on unification multiple times, it again puts the responsibility in the hands of North and South Vietnam. This document lacks original content in general. It was signed January 23, 1973, and the ceasefire commenced 4 days later, ending the Second Indochina War. Ceasefire being a loose description, because hostilities didn't end after the Americans left, and instead carried on through secret funding and operations from both sides. The Accords mainly functioned only to get the United States out of the war. There are two primary negotiators of this. On the U.S. side, Henry Kissinger, a prominent advisor under 4 U.S. presidents, and Secretary of State to 2. And on the North Vietnamese side, Le Duc Tho, a leader of communist movements in Vietnam. Both men were given the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts, with both giving back the medal in cash portion at some point. They had not believed they deserved it because of how long the war limped onward for. After the war, unification through democracy never happened. However, unification did occur, but through invasion. In the spring of 1975, the North started the Third Indochina War, and within a month, South Vietnam's capital, Saigon, was captured. The short-term repercussions of this were vast. South Vietnamese people of all ages were put into re-education camps, which resembled the Soviet gulags, by the new government. The Khmer Rouge, a communist organization, took over Cambodia, while other communist forces overthrew the Lao government. Although some conflicts, the Third Indochina War, technically carried on long after the 70s, the main events involving the independence of the countries were over. The Indochina War's negotiations were ultimately failures as lasting compromises. The causes of this failure boil down to ideological nationalism, unending desires for victory, and keeping peace brief. These major roadblocks made it difficult to prevent the nearly 2 decades of war in Indochina. Today, Vietnam continues to be a unified and communist nation. Nonetheless, they have been deviating further from these values. Because of hostility from China, who was once a good ally, they have moved towards other nations, such as, strangely enough, the United States. Laos follows a similar path. Cambodia has become a constitutional monarchy after tough years of communism under the brutal Khmer Rouge. If for whatever reason lasting peace had come to Vietnam early, there may have been very useful assets in Indochina. South Vietnam would have been a good ally for today's North Korean conflict because of its close proximity to the Korean peninsula. Assuming Cambodia and Laos's communist revolutions were largely influenced by Vietnam's unification and could have been stopped with the continued independence of South Vietnam, they could have eventually become U.S. allied democracies. In this case, containing communism once more after the Korean War could have put down some of the expansionist views of the Soviets and Chinese, possibly cutting funding to revolutions and changing the landscape of the world political stage to this day. Not only would some countries not fall to communism, but the USSR could have fallen earlier than the 90s because of the instability another loss may cause. The lack of compromise over the Indochina Wars surely altered history, but views conflicted, and any other outcome was extremely unlikely.